Pretty much just due to the cost, building a PC is just super daunting. The first part of any build is picking out the parts. I didn't have a particular budget, but I ended up around the $2,500 range. Really, there's a ton of stuff I could have cut back on and kept the same performance, but since it was my first build, I wanted to splurge a little bit and just get what I really wanted. Starting off with the main parts of the build, for my CPU, I went with a 14700K and then a Kraken Elite 360 to cool it. Then for my motherboard, I got the NZXT N7Z790, and for my GPU, I ended up settling on the 4070 Super Ti. In addition to all that, I got 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR5, a 2TB Samsung SSD, and an 850W power supply. For the case, it was between the O11 Mini and the H6 Flow, and in the end I ended up settling on the H6 just due to the more unique design and the better airflow. I really like how the bottom and side fans are recessed. I think it just gives the case a super clean look. Finally, the last parts I grabbed were 6 120mm Unifan V2s, and then I also grabbed 2 140s for the bottom fans. Moving on to the easy part of the build was the building itself. For probably the past 8 years, I've watched build guides and tutorials, so going into it, I felt pretty confident. First, I started off by swapping out all of the case fans for the Unifans I got, and this would probably end up being the hardest part of the build. Although the Unifans are super nice and they daisy chain together, they are a little thick, which made them hard to get into the recessed portions of the case. If you're gonna build in this case, yes, the V2s fit, but it takes some forcing and getting them in at just the right angle to get them to slide into place. Overall, putting the fans in was just super time consuming and stressful, and I really wouldn't recommend going with the Unifans if you're gonna put them in the H6 Flow. After I got all those fans in, I got out the motherboard and started taking off the shroud to get access to the SSD slot. Then I installed the M.2. One of the issues I had later on was the BIOS not recognizing the SSD, so I actually ended up swapping it down into the second slot on the motherboard to fix that issue. Next up was the CPU, which I gently placed into the socket, then pulled the lever down until the plastic piece popped out. After that, it was time to install the RAM, and I made sure to put it into the second and fourth slots on the motherboard to ensure that I was using dual channel RAM and wouldn't be leaving any performance on the table. Before putting everything into the case, I prepped the AIO by attaching the backplate to the motherboard and also putting on the rest of the Unifans onto the radiator. If you're using the Kraken Elite with Unifans, you're going to want to make sure to use the fan cable that has the separate fan and RGB connections and not the one that goes straight into the Lian Li hub. This just allows you to connect the fan straight into the splitter that comes off the AIO, and then the RGB cable goes back into the fan hub so you can still control everything with L-Connect 3. After I got the motherboard into the case, I started off by attaching the AIO using an X tightening pattern to make sure everything was tightened evenly. Then I used the screws that it came with to attach the radiator to the top of the case. With everything that I screwed in, I was really making sure not to over tighten anything. I didn't force anything to be more tight than it had to be, as that's just kind of a bad habit of mine when working on cars or anything else that things need to be tight on. I always try to make it as tight as possible, and really that's just not necessary. Next up was the power supply, which was the part I was probably most nervous about, but really the motherboard and the cables were labeled super clearly, so it was way easier than I expected. I ended up following along with this video to see where to plug in everything, as well as plug in the things like the case USB and case power, just to double check everything before I got it right. But really, everything was labeled super clearly on the motherboard, and it was really easy. Moving on to the last part of the build, which was installing the GPU, I started off by unscrewing 2 slots onto the case to make room, and then slid the card into place. Then I took those screws that I took out and reattached the card to the case to make sure everything was secure. And finally, after that, it was time to move everything to my desk and see if everything worked. When I turned it on at first, everything looked great. All the fans were spinning, everything lit up, and I thought I was in the clear. But there was no display. I got kind of spooked and stopped recording at this point, and it took me a good couple hours to figure out the issue. First, I started off by reseating the GPU and trying that a couple times, but that wasn't the fix. Then I tried starting it without the GPU, and I was able to get display through the motherboard's HDMI port, so at this point I was pretty frustrated and ended up setting up Windows without the GPU installed. Like I mentioned before, this is about the point where I realized the SSD wasn't getting recognized, so I switched that to the second port down, and that fix the issue. After getting the SSD squared away and setting up Windows, I started to do some more research. Some videos I looked at said to power drain the PC and try again. Others were saying to uninstall all of the graphics drivers and try again. Others said to reseat the RAM and try again, but none of that worked. In the end, the fix was pretty simple, and I ended up going back into the BIOS to see if there's any other settings I could change to get the PC to recognize the GPU. And I realized that the BIOS was about 4 versions behind what was currently available, so I decided I should probably just update that and see if that would work. Thankfully, this was the fix, and seeing display through the GPU was just a huge relief. And finally, I could move on to downloading and installing all of my programs and files. I kind of forgot how huge a lot of my plugins are. Omni and Keyscape combined for a total of almost 150 gigabytes, and my drum and one-shot kit folder that has grown over the years hit almost 60 gigabytes. So it took a while for everything to get installed so I could start testing anything out. But so far it's been great. Probably the biggest change for me is everything being on an SSD and not a hard drive. Everything opens so quickly, and I can boot up my computer within 20 or 30 seconds. It used to be I would wake up, I would power on my laptop, and I would go eat breakfast or go lift. By the time I got back up here, it would be ready to actually do something. But now it's pretty much immediate, which is just crazy. A lot of the little things I'm really just surprised by, like right now, OBS in the background is only using 0.1% utilization of my CPU, where it used to be at 15 or 20% on my laptop at idle. This just means that I have no limitations when recording videos or streaming anymore, so I'll be able to think of a lot more interesting stuff to do and not be limited by my hardware. But really, the thing that I'm looking forward to the most isn't gaming or making more detailed beats. It's really just editing. Over the past 3 years, I've edited with the choppiest playback. It was to the point where I was rendering out every 20 seconds that I would edit just to make sure it looked okay. And as I wanted to progress and make my editing more interesting and more engaging, it just got worse and worse. So I'm gonna resume this video probably tomorrow morning once I've edited this and let you know how it all performs. Well, alright, so I'm pretty much done editing the video, and this has probably been the easiest time editing I've ever had. I think I really summed it up by saying there's almost no limitations. I've gotten smooth playback the entire time, and the fans on the PC haven't even really spun up at all. The CPU and GPU really aren't even under load when I'm editing, which is crazy because this used to be the limit of the old computer. So this being the baseline of the new computer just kind of shows how much more room I have to grow and improve with this new one and trying out more interesting things. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what I come up with and utilizing the new hardware to its potential, and I think it'll be pretty fun. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. I'll probably have some tutorials that come out before this, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.